Her arms were cut off. Her legs were cut off. Her ears were cut off. Her tongue was cut off.
I was busy thinking about
what happened?
Bad bitch, ass fat, 40-inch hair, yours came in a pack. Camel toe fat, you can see it from the back. Go bad bitch, go bad bitch, go bad bitch, go bad bitch, go bad.
Imagine TikTok being so powerful that they actually help you identify the person that almost murdered you. On my For You page the other day, I found this viral video that you guys might recognize, which states videos I took before almost being hunted and murdered. I clicked on her page, listened to her story, and was like, I have to know more. So I reached out and got the full thing. This is the case of Flowers Don't Growl. April 29th through April 30th of 2019, Taylor and her boyfriend Chris decided to take a trip to Falls Creek Falls, Tennessee. Taylor was 5 months pregnant at the time, so they figured they needed one last little trip before they were going to have a baby. And Taylor swore that Chris was going to propose. So that's why she documented so much of this trip, not even realizing that later on it was going to be used as evidence. So they set up at their assigned camping lot. They spent their time hiking, exploring, having fun. Taylor would collect flowers along the way to document it for memory's sake, but please keep these flowers in mind. And then on the second day, everyone from their assigned area was gone except for them. So they were more alone than before, or so they thought.
It just doesn't make sense. This case is strange. Joshua Maddox went missing in 2008, and he wasn't found until 2015. When an unused cabin a quarter-mile away from his home was being demolished, his body was found inside the chimney with his knees above his head, and the police ruled it an accidental death, and they said he climbed in from the top and got stuck. But that doesn't explain how he got in the chimney, because there was a metal grate on top of it blocking the entrance, and he couldn't have gone in through the fireplace because there was a heavy breakfast bar that had been ripped out of the wall and pushed in front of it. Or why he was only wearing a shirt. All his other clothes were folded up inside the cabin. So he would have had to have been inside the cabin, taken off his clothes, gone outside, climbed up on the roof, and then tried to enter the cabin again through the chimney?
Welcome back to part 2 of Flowers Don't Growl. So later in the night on their last day, they ended up hearing a loud crash. There's very windy roads nearby, so they figured that it was a wreck. And just to make sure kids weren't involved and that everyone was safe, they got out of their tent and ran over to the crash site, which was maybe half a mile away to go check on the people. The sheriff ends up showing up and it's like a DUI situation, but everyone ultimately was okay. So before heading back to their campsite, Taylor says she has to go use the restroom. So her and Chris walk over to the bathroom so she can do her thing, and in the distance they see a light flickering. And as it gets closer, they notice that someone is running with a flashlight. So they're both cracking jokes to each other like, oh my gosh, this guy really has to go to the bathroom. But once he approaches the restroom, he ends up stopping right at them instead of actually going into the bathroom. And states, and I quote, "Wow, you guys are fast." Creepy. Taylor notices that he has a weird smile on his face and feels really nauseous but just associates it with the pregnancy. So just to be nice, they continue to have a conversation with him. But ultimately, this is where things go wrong.
My boss sent us a critical thinking email and she was not ready for my response. This is the email and my response. So her email says, "Read carefully and provide me your answer. You are in the garden. There are 34 people in the yard. You kill 30. How many people are in the garden?" And this is my response. 0 is most likely, however the answer could be up to 4. I would have to leave the garden in order to kill the people in the yard, unless I magically learned how to use long-range weapons. Assuming I only am left with my current skill set, which amounts to a yellow belt in karate from when I was 8, I'd need to be up close, which would leave the garden empty. So, moving on to after the killings, I'd most certainly not be returning to the garden. A yard that holds 30 plus people? This is clearly not my house. And I'm not waiting around to get caught, so on the run I go. Where to? Mind your business. Now, the up to 4 comes in based on what the 4 survivors do while the commotion is happening. They could see the garden as a hiding hiding place if they didn't find any other means to escape. Previous training has taught us to run if you can, hide if you can't. So while I left the garden empty to trim the yard, it may have served as a shelter to one or more of the savvy survivors. Also, this is more than I ever thought I would type about killing in a work email, so for the record, I'm fine, I'm not crazy, I just listened to too many true crime podcasts. Sincerely and benevolently, Chris.
Imagine resorting to murdering your spouse after only 8 days of marriage. Today, we're going to be talking about the murder of Cody Johnson. To give a little bit of backstory into his life, he was born on April 8th, 1998, was very outdoorsy, loved cars, got a career in making custom commercial cars, and his boss was his best friend. He had an awesome relationship with his family, with his friends, an amazing job that he loved, but all he really wanted was a wife to go along with it. Well, in Halloween of 2011, he met Jordan Graham. She was a huge Christian, very active in the church, but she was also very shy and reserved. But this attracted Cody to her. They were like yin and yang, perfect opposites. And Cody knew he was going to marry her after just a few weeks of knowing Jordan. He fell so hard, but a lot of their friends and family was noticing that Jordan wasn't falling quite as hard. And it's very important that I state that because of Jordan's religious views, celibacy was huge for her. So Jordan and Cody decided to buy a house and get married. It was very noticeable that Jordan was more excited about the wedding, though, than the marriage. And when it was time for the wedding, this is when things took a turn for the worse.
By looking at this picture, you probably would think that this is somebody's cute grandma, right? Well, what if I told you that this sweet-looking elderly woman was actually a serial killer? I'm not joking either. They literally found 7 bodies buried in her own backyard. This is the story of Dorothea Puente, and I advise you not to watch this at night because it's a creepy one. People who knew Dorothea thought she was such a sweet lady and they loved her stories. But most of her stories were lies that she would make up along the way. She ran a boarding house in Sacramento, California, and would take care of tenants that were disabled or just needed extra help, and most of them being elderly. And nobody thought anything strange was going on until a tenant went missing. So investigators decide to show up at the house and ask some questions. And another tenant secretly slips them a paper. The tenant basically tells them, like, you guys need to check the backyard. Something weird is going on. There's a shovel and stuff. And they were shocked at what they found.
One of the most insane serial killers I have ever learned about, I still to this day believe didn't work alone. So you guys know Jack the Ripper, right? Well, this guy not only outlasted and outdid him, but he put New York in one of the biggest states of fear and taunted investigators for years. Before we get into who he is and why I don't think he acted alone, let's talk about what he did. The first kill he ever made was stabbing 2 young girls on Christmas Eve of 1975. At this time, New York was an absolute shambles. People were being killed and assaulted all the time. Robberies were happening, bodies were being found, and the police really couldn't keep up with everything, so whenever this happened, it wasn't like a big news headliner. Well, a few months later, 2 girls were shot sitting in their car. Both of them ended up surviving, but it happened so fast that they didn't have any information on the suspect. Just some .44 caliber bullets left on scene. Well, the next attack occurred whenever this couple was sitting in a car. They reported that the whole car felt like it exploded, and the girl looked over and saw a bullet wound in the guy's head. Because of the bullets used, the police were able to make the connections.
My serial killer father from prison sends me letters like this. So I got married this summer in July, and I got a letter like this from my dad with a picture of my picture from my wedding. So he's somehow able to see my Instagram from prison. In the letter, he says, I'm fat and my husband is fat and we don't run. He then tells me maybe this marriage will work and ends with, why wasn't I invited? Remember, most of all, daughter, I never stopped loving you. And then for Christmas last year, I got this package in the mail. I was very terrified to open it, but here were its contents. A purse that his inmate friend from prison made me.
Part 3 on Flowers Don't Growl. So Chris and Taylor continue their weird interaction with this man. Chris explaining that they got to the wreck fast because they wanted to make sure everyone was okay. And the guy goes, yeah, I guess I'm just used to it. And Taylor's confused because, like, used to what? Hikes? Car wrecks? They ask what he does, and he says he travels a lot and likes to go camping. And Taylor's starting to get very uncomfortable now, tells Chris that, hey, they need to go back to the campsite because the police will be over there waiting for their statements. Just trying to make an excuse to leave, and Chris could tell it was BS. And as they start to take steps back, he starts to take steps towards them, asking questions like, hey, how long are you guys going to be here for? And his hand kept playing with his hoodie pocket. Chris was starting to pick up on the message as they continued to walk backwards, while the man followed them forward. And then this guy decides to tell them a little story. He was like, car accident. It got me thinking this morning as I was hiking and I passed these flowers. I stopped because they were so beautiful and I heard a deep growl and it scared me. And it makes me think, you never know what day is going to be your last. That's when they saw the knife. Part 4 to Flowers Don't Growl. So this is when Taylor noticed the outline in his hoodie pocket was the shape of a knife. It completely clicked for her and she told her husband that they needed to run. He looked at her like, what's going on? And she just states, flowers don't growl. So they took off running and this is when he took off chasing them. And I'll show a map of where exactly they were chased. This is where Taylor and Chris ended up. And this is where they last saw the guy chasing them. And they made it all the way back to the crash site and luckily the police were still there. They told them what happened and made a report. And 2 of the cops went out looking for him but couldn't find him anywhere, while the other officer accompanied them back to the campsite so that they could pack up their stuff and leave. They tried to get updated on their case later on, but never ever got an update. Having the baby and it being a couple years later, Taylor sits down and ends up making a TikTok. It goes viral and a bunch of people start to DM her with potential suspects. Taylor stopped looking at her DMs because it got so emotional, but one user that messaged her lived in the Falls Creek Falls area and had followed a particular case. She opened the DM and saw the man. This is James L. Jordan.
It's been 25 years since JonBenet Ramsey was found dead in her parents' basement. And this whole entire time, I was convinced that the family had something to do with it. But not anymore. Did you know that their house was over 7,000 square feet? They didn't have any cameras around their house. It would have made it so easy for an intruder to come into their home, hurt this little girl, and leave. But who would that intruder be? Who would do something so disgusting like that? This is Glenn Meyer. He was obsessed with the case after it happened. He had newspaper clippings all over his room. And when his wife would ask him if he was the one who did it, he would just look at her and smile. And he had a history of hurting his wife and kids. The kids were frightened of him. 2 days before JonBenet Ramsey was murdered, he shows up to the house uninvited while they were having a Christmas.
So did you guys know that our typical search engines are only 4% of what we see on the web, which is like Google, Bing, Firefox? I'm going to be talking about some of the most popular websites on the dark web, so get ready because this is going to be intense. So here's a photo example just to give you guys an idea of what this looks like. At the top is the area that we do our research for school on, or stalk our exes, I don't know. And then 500 times larger than the surface web is the deep web. The deep web is filled with information that we cannot access, such as medical documents, iCloud, personal information. Like I obviously can't Google what your family history or intake forms say, so that's where this is stored. And then the dark web holds the last 6%. This part of the internet was created by the US Navy in the 1990s, and it was made so spies could share info without being tracked. Well, then the government decided to release it to the public. And you need the specific software to go to it called Tor, which stands for the Onion Router. It hides your identity and gives you access to non-surface web pages. And on this section of the internet, you can do things like buy people's credit card information, get counterfeit money, participate in drug trafficking, hire hackers and hitmen, and way worse.
Everybody okay?
Kinda.
There's the kids that were rescued.
No, we weren't rescued. We
found a dead body.
We found a body.
What? Where at?
Right
Down
there.
there. And the tide came up, so we couldn't get out.
Yeah.
They just had to take us to a
Welcome to Flowers Don't Growl Part 5. So Taylor immediately recognized James L. Jordan as being the person that tried to attack her and her now husband that night. And horrifyingly enough, he ended up killing 2 weeks later, stabbing one female victim that did survive, but stabbing the male to death. The male victim ended up sending out an SOS last minute before he passed, and the police came to arrest Jordan. And honestly, one of the worst things was that he was not found guilty by reason of insanity. And Taylor has tried to reach out to police multiple times because he was very calm and collected the night that her and her husband survived. She has scoured all of her photos trying to figure out where he was at and found out that he was staying back here outside of the regular lots. Followers have pointed out things like this creepy shadow in this video, but ultimately we don't really know where he was at. But because of the story that he told about the flowers, she thinks that he had been stalking them for a while, watching her pick them. Taylor now is using her page to promote safety, learning how to protect yourself and carrying items such as mace or a taser, and campsites where you pay to camp probably should have security. Taylor is tagged below, so please go follow her to keep up with her story.
This is the woman people are calling the real-life Gone Girl. She faked her own horrific abduction and wasted 5 years of police time. You're not going to want to miss this one. It is absolutely insane. This all begins November 2nd of 2016. Keith Papini returned home from work at around 5 p.m. He was expecting to come home to his 34-year-old wife, Sherry Papini, and his 2 kids, but they weren't home. Keith called the daycare where his kids were staying and asked when Sherry came to pick up the kids. The daycare then told him that she never came, so the kids were okay. He immediately finds this very strange, calls the police, and reports her missing. This was taken very seriously by the police. She seemed to have vanished out of thin air. It wasn't long before the news was reporting on it, and her missing posters were all over California. Because there were no leads, fingers pointed at Keith, the husband. Everyone thought it was Keith. He even took a polygraph test and passed it, but people still thought it was him. That's until 22 days later, when Sherry returned. 150 miles away from where she was last seen, a driver finds her walking on the side of the road in chains. This driver called the police and she was brought in. She was covered in bruises. She had lost weight and her back had been branded. Understandably, police were shocked. When asked what happened, she claimed that 2 Hispanic women abducted her. She claimed that they were going to sell her to a man and that's why she was branded. Police were taking this very seriously. Sherry explained in detail the abuse that she went through and the room she was in. She also described the women enough for them to create a sketch of people who did not exist, because it was all a lie. Police found it very strange that these abductors just let her go, but this isn't to say that they didn't believe her. They definitely did, and they took it very seriously. They were determined to find out who did this to this poor mother of 2. The government helped pay for therapy for her PTSD and anxiety after this event. During this time, police were testing her clothes, and they finally found DNA. This DNA belonged to a man, not a woman. And she apparently encountered no men during this kidnapping. They put it through the police database and nothing came up. That's until 2020 when they decided to put it through a genealogy database, hoping that someone related to the person with this DNA went on like Ancestry or anything like that. With this, they were able to find the exact person with that DNA. And this person was Sherry's ex-boyfriend. The story only gets crazier from here, so come back for part 2. It'll be up the moment I'm done filming.
This is Worst Deaths Imaginable number 5, and I gotta be honest with you, I am really struggling with this one. As usual, trigger warning, this is another claustrophobic related death, so you've been warned. This was 14-year-old Harley Dilley from Port Clinton, Ohio. Harley was last seen alive on December 20th, 2019. At 6:15 that morning, he approached his mother and said, "Hey, I'm not feeling well, I can't go to school," where his mom said, "Get your ass to school." The following evening, they reported Harley as missing. I guess it was normal for him to be gone overnight. I'm not sure why that's normal for a 14-year-old, but Harley also had autism and ADHD. and he was being assessed for oppositional defiant disorder, or ODD, and he had PTSD apparently from childhood beatings he got from his sister. Oh my god, this kid had it rough. When he was reported missing, officers went out and searched all of his friends' homes, his ex-girlfriend's home. They obviously searched his home, but he was never found. A month would go by and no one found him. This is until police received a tip to check a home that was in Harley's neighborhood that was under renovation. When the search began, they looked in the windows of that home, but they never saw anything out of the ordinary. The police then entered the home with the permission of the owners, who were not staying in the house at the time because it was being renovated, and they were immediately hit with the smell of decomposition. While searching the second floor, near the fireplace vent, they found Harley's jacket, and they would later find his glasses on the floor. Given the proximity to the fireplace vent, they looked inside the chimney, where they found the decomposing body of 14-year-old Harley Dilley. Whew. Okay, so what they think happened was Harley was able to get to the roof of the house somehow, and he went to crawl inside the chimney, and they say he went feet first. All of this, by the way, to avoid school. Harley was 4'9" and wore clothing size 10 to 12. The interior of the chimney was 9 inches by 13 inches. His shoulder width was about 12 inches. When Harley realized he was stuck, he began taking off his clothes to create less bulk. They think he did this to give himself more room to breathe. Oh, they believe he tried wiggling, but he couldn't, and he got stuck. Like, permanently stuck. He managed to shove some of his clothing items out of the vent with his feet, I guess. By the way, the police moved the jacket. It didn't fall right there. This is the chimney. This is what he was stuck in. They said his right hand was stuck behind his back, and his left hand was stuck this way against his chest, but his head was pointed up. He died of compressed asphyxiation, and it likely took several hours. It was a slow and painful death.
So what was Kalala's response to thinking his wife might be cheating on him without any proof? He paid nearly $7,000 to a group of men to kill her. Noella ended up getting news of her stepmother passing away, so she ended up flying back to her hometown for the funeral. This was January 21st of 2015. Kalala ended up calling her on the phone, and he instructed her to go outside and get some fresh air. And she was immediately confronted by an armed man who directed her to get into the vehicle. When she got into the vehicle, there was 2 other armed men waiting for her inside. They then blindfolded her, took her to a warehouse, and tied her to a chair. And instead of doing what they were hired to do, they ended up telling her about Kalala's plan. They had a personal moral rule not to kill women or children. So they let her know that her husband put a hit on her. She did not believe their original claims on what was happening, so they ended up calling Kalala, putting him on speaker, and asking what they should do next, and he responded with kill her. Noella was so shocked by this information that she fainted hearing his response. So this is when they came together to make a plan to get back.
This is Worst Deaths Imaginable, Episode 3. On the afternoon of Tuesday, April 10th, 2018, 16-year-old Kyle Plush from Ohio was in the parking lot of Seven Hills School. He had driven there in the family's 2004 Honda Odyssey, and he was there to practice tennis. He had gone to the third row of the minivan, and then he went to reach over to grab his tennis equipment. As he was reaching, his knee was pressed against the bottom of the seat, when something unexpected and honestly quite horrifying happened. Let me show you a brief video. So as you just saw in that little brief video, and then I can show you right here in this image, the seat literally flipped, and it took Kyle and it turned him upside down. So now the upper half of his body was trapped with the seat pressed against his chest and his head, obviously upside down against the flooring of that part of the car, therefore making his legs kind of poking up. And so if someone were to look in the window, they would see his legs. This was not any kind of known issue with Honda Odysseys. There was no recalls at the time for anything like this. At 3:14 p.m. that afternoon, while Kyle was trapped in the vehicle, he was able to call 911. Immediately when the 911 operator picked up, Kyle began screaming, "Help, I need help, I'm stuck in my van." The operator was continually trying to find out where he was located, and he kept saying Seven Hills, and then It was an inaudible moment where she couldn't pick up what he was saying after 7 Hills. And in the 911 call, allegedly, you can hear him banging against the window and screaming, "I'm in desperate need for help." The call went on for about 3 minutes and then it got disconnected. The 911 operator tried to call back, but it went straight to voicemail. At 3:21 p.m., officers were dispatched to that location. They arrived at 3:26 p.m., they searched and searched and searched and couldn't find anyone. And then they closed out that request at 3:37 and went about their day. At 3:35 p.m., Plush calls 911 again, saying again, "I'm stuck in my van. This is not a joke. This is not a joke. Send officers immediately. I'm nearly dead." And then he said, "I probably don't have much time left. Tell my mom I love her if I die." This second call was made when the officers were still there, but for some reason this information was not transmitted to the officers. Just to give you an idea, the stars where he was parked, and I don't know where the officers were actually searching, but obviously they didn't find him. 6 hours after his first 911 call, his father went to the school and found him. Kyle was dead. He died a slow and painful death from asphyxia due to chest compressions, and somehow no one saw him. His feet were visible. That had to be so terrifying.
Two of the most terrifying dolls to ever exist come down to Robert the doll and Annabelle. And first, we'll just start with Robert. And I'm going to be as respectful as possible when talking about this because apparently if you're not, you could die. That's why Robert's casing is filled with apology notes from people who have had severe bad luck after disrespecting him upon seeing him at the museum. So let's get into Robert's backstory. As you guys know, the movie Chucky, who was based on this homicidal doll, was inspired by the doll Robert. Well, there was this family, the Otto family, and back in the early 1900s, they had a 10-year-old son named Eugene, who was given a doll that was gifted by one of the family servants. Well, this doll is honestly just very creepy. He is 3 feet in length and dressed up in a sailor's costume, and while this is terrifying now, back in the early 1900s, he was just a normal doll. Well, upon receiving the gift of Robert, Eugene got extremely attached to him. He'd bathe him, eat with him, and even sleep with him.
Worst deaths imaginable, number 16, and it's also a theme park death. Viewer discretion is advised. And for this one, we are going to Queensland, Australia. Sorry, Jared, I know this is your neck of the woods, but I just had to do this one. This is a theme park called Dream World. It opened in December of 1981. It now includes 47 different attractions, including 4 roller coasters. In December of 1986, it opened Thunder River Rapids, a ride much like many others around the world, where you would board a raft like this one that simulates what a raging river would be like. In October of 2016, a horrible tragedy would occur that would shut the ride down forever. 6 passengers boarded one of the rafts: Kate Goodchild, Luke Dorset, Ruzba Argai, and Cindy Lowe. Also on the raft were 2 children, Kieran Lowe and Ebony Goodchild. Now, at the end of this ride, much like all the other rides just like this one, you go up a conveyor belt that will lead you to the place where you depart. Now, when you get to the top, the water is supposed to be there to kind of help bring the raft along. But on this day, the water levels were not where they were supposed to be. There were 2 large water pumps, and one of those pumps had failed. The water pumps are absolutely essential to this ride operating safely and properly. But because of the failure of one of them, the water levels rapidly dropped. Now, what happened was one raft got to this area, the water levels were dropped, and so the raft itself got stuck. And then the raft holding the 6 passengers I mentioned earlier, well, this happened. I'll give you a trigger warning, but this is just an animation. So the raft with the 6 passengers on it flipped. The picture behind me is the aftermath. There is nothing graphic about it, but this is the end result. And yes, this is the exact photo. By some miracle, the 2 children were actually thrown to safety, but sadly the 4 adults would not be so lucky. Again, nothing graphic is shown here, but what happened was that when the boat flipped, it flipped completely over, and 2 of the adults got stuck under the raft and they drowned. Drowning takes a while. Drowning is considered one of the worst ways to go. Now, the other two, because the ride's operator didn't know which emergency stop button to hit them both! The conveyor belt was still going, and two of the adults got trapped inside the conveyor belt, and they were slowly crushed to death. Slowly and painfully. Thunder River Rapids was then permanently closed.
Something that is just a weird fear of mine is doctors pretending to be doctors. Like not actually having their licensure, but just playing the role, and secretly killing people while doing so. And yes, this has happened before. The most haunted hotel in America is known as the Crescent Hotel. I don't know if anybody else can relate to this, but I loved staying up at night watching ghost hunters. I would run around with my little EMF detector seeing if I could find ghosts myself. Well, my favorite episode of Ghost Hunters actually covered the Crescent. They ended up actually making contact with one of the ghosts, but I never really deep dived into how creepy this hotel's history actually is. So the Crescent Hotel was built in 1986. And it was a resort for the wealthy, rich, and powerful. But pretty fast, they found this whole hotel to be very unmanageable. And it was weirdly very accident prone in the building process. There was a stonemason named Michael who passed away, but we'll get to that later. Well, it reopened in 1908 as a college for girls. This photo gives me very much Midsummer vibes. While this college was considered prestige, they covered up a death.
How many of you actually knew that Jeffrey Dahmer was murdered in prison alongside another convicted murderer? Honestly, I did not know. Let's talk about these two folks. So this was salesman Jesse Anderson, who was born in Illinois, but then eventually would move to Wisconsin. Later down the road, Jesse would eventually marry Barbara, and they had 3 children together. Well, apparently by 1992, the marriage wasn't going so well. Jesse thought the marriage was failing. So he wanted to give it one more shot, right? On the night of April 21st, 1992, he took his wife out to go see a movie, and then afterwards they went to go have dinner, and at that point he planned to try to reconcile their marriage. Apparently it didn't go well. After they left the TGI Fridays that they were eating at in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, they would walk to their car, and not too soon afterward, police were called because there were 2 people on the ground bleeding. It was Jesse Anderson and his wife, Barbara. They had both apparently been stabbed. Barbara immediately went into a coma and would eventually die a couple days later, but Jesse, who had 4 stab wounds to his chest, would survive. Most of his stab wounds were superficial. Barbara was stabbed 21 times in the face. Jesse said that the assailants were 2 black men. He said he managed to knock off one of their hats, a Los Angeles Clippers hat. So police were looking for 2 black men who have done this. Well, in their investigation, it turns out that it wasn't 2 black men. It was Jesse Anderson who stabbed his wife multiple times in the face. By using forensic smarts and also witness testimony, that's how they came to that conclusion. Jesse had bought the hat from this man that same day. Jesse was convicted and sentenced to 60 years to life. He would eventually end up in the same prison as Jeffrey Dahmer. And also, Christopher Scarver. Christopher was working in Milwaukee at a conservation corps job group. He was promised a full-time position at this job by a man who eventually that man would be terminated.